All right, I've got 10 o'clock. We've got 51 participants so far on the call, and I'm sure a few more will join us. Good morning. Welcome to our final EAB webinar as we continue to work on information that could be relevant to our next strategic long-range plan. Today, our focus is really the future of work, the future of careers, and how does that connect into the academic programs at a university like ours. And so we've got, not only do we have the long-range plan steering committee working on this. The provost has an academic task force evaluating kind of the future of academic programs. There's a lot of interest and conversation on this topic, and the future of careers is one, clearly not the only, but one important piece of data that will help us in the work as we focus on the future of academic programs at our university. And so to lead our conversation and facilitate today, we have Max Milder from EAB. His focus is on organizational design work for online education. He's done research into employer and industry partnerships. He has a background and knowledge of both online education and academic affairs. And so with that, Max, let me turn it over to you to introduce yourself and the topic a little more, and then to get us started.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Cliff, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us. I'm a director with our research team. So as Cliff mentioned, my focus area is primarily within professional, adult, graduate, and online programming. That being said, some of my research at EAB has focused on issues in academic affairs around teaching and learning, and some work in undergraduate enrollment as well. And so to give you a sense for what I hope to cover across the next 90 minutes or so, would love to start with some upfront learning about how the nature of work and careers is changing for millennials, Generation Z students, the folks who are most recently graduating from your institution and others, how their experiences differ from previous generations, and how that might lead us to rethink the role of universities somewhat, and how we prepare students not only for the first step out into the workforce, but also for long, fruitful careers moving forward. From there, want to touch on a few different areas of focus. So one, given the changing nature of work, how do we think about how to re-emphasize certain skills or competencies that already exist within the undergraduate core? Second, want to touch a little bit on how we think about new program development. So how do we think about aligning with workforce needs in a way that is complementary to what already exists at the institution? There's a lot of discourse in higher ed about technical or professional or workforce related training, how that might run counter to the liberal arts or humanities missions of a lot of institutions. This is not a black or white discussion. This is not an either or proposition. And so I want to tease out some of those ideas about how all of those pieces can fit together, how we can continue to provide for many students a rich liberal arts experience, but still prepare them for the first step into careers and into the workforce moving forward. Finally, towards the end, I want to talk a little bit about how institutions can work directly with employers as well. So Cliff teed up that we have done quite a bit of research in this space. How do you actually work with employers to help with ongoing development, access to education, which is a growing trend as well? So students who historically maybe had never considered higher education as an option for them, but are now able to access that through tuition reimbursement payment directly from their employers. That has a big impact on enrollment forecasts for a lot of institutions as well. So I want to touch on that towards the end of our conversation. The last point I'll bring up logistically is there's a Q&A box. I've included a few discussion questions throughout the course of this session. So we'll have a chance to pull up at the end of every section, gather our thoughts, get some feedback from folks in the room. Please do use that Q&A box. So I'll make sure I'm monitoring that throughout the session. So if there are items that are confusing, elements where you'd like the ideas unpacked a little bit more, please do feel free to let me know as we go through. With that, let's go ahead and jump into it and talk a little bit about how careers are changing today. This is an incredibly oversimplified example, but I think some of the books and items you see on this slide are illustrative of how our way of thinking about career tracks for students coming out of higher education potentially is changing over time. For a lot of US history, there was the Horatio Alger story, which focused on how individuals could pull themselves up by their bootstraps. There was a focus on hard work and determination and persistence as really the key to career success long term. As our country industrialized, as we became more urban, more interconnected, folks like Dale Carnegie put out books that focused on interpersonal relationships, how we influence people to get ahead in our careers. Interestingly now, so much of the focus for working professionals is on continuous or lifelong learning. So the number one career-related book on Amazon right now is a book called Ultra Learning, all about continuously mastering new skills. And you'll see through some of the online platforms like Coursera or Lumosity, millions and millions of working professionals in the US and across the world who are very interested in learning new skills, whether that's in anticipation of future career moves, whether that's in reaction to losing their job or currently being unemployed. We're seeing tens of millions of new students gravitating towards those platforms in an effort to learn more. Interestingly, the most popular MOOC, massively open online course on Coursera, is actually called Learning How to Learn. So it's all about how working professionals can build their own skills over time. It's actually not about the process of learning a particular professional or technical skill. It's about becoming more flexible and more nimble in the course of their careers. That's a big kind of psychological change from how a lot of working professionals have approached this in the past. Now, what I want to talk through are these four trends, which are very much changing the relationship between higher education institutions and our broader society here in the US. And I'll dive into each of these four in a little bit more depth. One, there's certainly increasing pressure on ROI, or some might call it ROE, return on education. This is coming from students themselves, but increasingly parents of your prospective undergraduates, from your state legislatures, from the mass media in the US. A lot of it focused on discrete measurable outcomes for students, right? The idea that we might measure salary for students a year out of college, 5 years out of college, 10 years out. How do we think about the returns on the investment, both for individuals and more broadly as states or societies? That's a growing pressure, certainly, that we're facing. The idea of higher ed as a meritocracy is being called into question. So certainly there has been lots written about increasing inequality more broadly in our society, but what role does higher education play within that system? Historically, we've seen it as maybe one of the great equalizers, something that actually allows folks to break generations of poverty within their families. But there are a lot of indicators that actually show that maybe higher ed is actually just reinforcing a lot of the trends that we see more broadly within the culture as well. There's a lot of focus on aligning with industry skill needs. And what we're seeing candidly is that those industries and the skill needs themselves are changing faster than ever, which makes it very difficult for institutions to keep up with some of those changes. When you're thinking about high-tech skills that might turn over and become obsolete within a period of 4 or 5, even 6 years, right? Finally, there's the expanding provider landscape as well. So increasingly, universities like yours are not only competing with other institutions in your state, across the nearest state lines, but you're competing with the likes of Coursera and Lumosity and other apps and websites and aggregators that compete for students' attention and might provide some of the short-term skill development opportunities that they're looking for. So how do we think about the place of a university within that ecosystem? Where do we actually invest our resources and our time moving forward? And where do we see some of those other offerings as maybe complementary pieces in this whole lifelong learning process? Now, first, some commentary on how graduates from universities are perceived today. And a lot of this comes from articles that you'll see in sources like the New York Times. Corporate recruiters who talk about how the majority of folks coming out of college these days are simply not prepared for work. A lot of college presidents themselves saying that their students are less prepared and they simply work less hard than they did 10 or 20 years ago. The reality is that this has been the case for nearly every generation of corporate leaders or university presidents. There's always an intergenerational dynamic where folks lament that seemingly this younger generation doesn't understand how things work. They don't work hard enough. They're not prepared enough for the future of work. Part of this is driven by also how corporations see their youngest employees as long-term investments. So you'll see on the right-hand side here some statistics about how long folks within different age demographics actually stay in a given job. So you'll see that the average job tenure for a young person, a millennial, 25 to 34, is just under 3 years. And there's actually a lot of job-based research that shows that it actually takes a couple of years for a new entry-level employee to become fully productive in their new job. So essentially, as these folks are finding their feet, fully getting productive themselves, they're often looking for the next new opportunity moving forward. What that's created in the private sector is kind of a downward spiral. Corporations are more and more reluctant to invest in ongoing professional development for their employees because they don't stay. And then their new entry-level employees end up not staying because they don't see any professional development opportunities. They don't really see any potential for advancement themselves. In previous generations, it was much more common for someone to graduate from college, get a good paying job out of school, and then potentially stay with that same employer for 40 or 50 years until they retire. And the reality is that workers today move jobs far more frequently. They're moving employers, but also increasingly they're moving across industries or occupational groups as well. So taking much more varied paths throughout the 40 or 50 years that they're working. Some of this is being addressed by how some large employers are thinking about professional development for their employees, right? So LinkedIn, led by Reid Hoffman, has created essentially what they call tours of duty, understanding that they won't ever be able to take or create a long-term 40 or 50-year pathway for employees. So they actually proactively build in opportunities for them to experience different divisions within the broader corporate infrastructure. So you go and you take a 2-year tour of duty in some cases. You map out specific objectives for that tour. You map out what specifically you've learned from that process. And then you actually build out a more diverse set of employable skills moving forward that actually makes it easier for you to move divisions in the future. And so LinkedIn has found that they're able to hold on to more of their employees long-term for exactly that reason. Now, there's been a ton written about return on education within the higher ed sector. The college rankings from US News and World Report have potentially been one of the more harmful developments in the higher ed industry. A lot of pushback that actually the rankings themselves are incredibly subjective. There's a big portion of the methodology that's just driven by the perception of their peers. It creates a lot of perverse incentives for universities to actually keep out students who might be qualified to graduate, simply so you can look more selective, so you can look more elite, so you can continue to concentrate resources on serving a relatively small number of students. Now, over the past few years, we've seen an explosion, really, of alternate rankings for institutions. How do we actually quantify the return on some of these experiences, right? So CNBC or Money talking about the best return on investment for these institutions, the best value for money. The Economist putting out a ranking focused on career outcomes and salary for students. Those are helpful to a certain extent, but those are biased in their own ways. If you look at any of those alternate ranking mechanisms for higher ed, they are dominated by technical and engineering focused institutions. They focus primarily on early returns for salary. So they're looking at 5 or 10-year salary rates after graduation, which actually diminishes the return that you would see from other types of institutions. And there's a lot of research that shows that actually liberal arts graduates in general tend to earn more over the course of their career. But those returns just tend to come a little bit later on, closer to 20 or 30 years later. Even some systems, so the Kansas City Technical College system is focusing on how they actually measure the social value of some of their programs. So understanding that they might be preparing folks for low-paying jobs that actually have a huge impact on the local community. Social workers, folks who work in early childhood education, for example. These are never folks who are going to earn large amounts of money. Based on some of those ROI statistics or calculations, they won't look like they're performing particularly well. But those are still hugely valuable contributions. And those are likely students who are very satisfied with their experience and their career path moving forward. So how do we measure some of those? That's an ongoing question. And really, there isn't a perfect metric out there that captures all of this activity. The second issue we see is that there's increasing scrutiny over the role of higher ed in our meritocracy and in how we think about inequality more broadly across the country. Raj Chetty is an economist at Harvard, and he's done some really incredible work mapping out how students from different income groups experience higher education and then are able to actually move between different income or wealth brackets within the US. Some of the findings have been pretty depressing, to be honest. It finds that the most likely determinant of a person's success is actually the income bracket that they're born into. So regardless of how much we see ourselves as part of a meritocracy in our country, higher income students are disproportionately represented at some of the most elite selective universities in the country. So much so that children from the top 1% of the income bracket are 77 times more likely to attend a top-ranked private college than those from the bottom 20%. So much so that folks who even have roughly equivalent academic profiles coming out of high school, someone from the top rungs of that income ladder is much more likely to graduate from college than someone closer to the bottom. Anthony Carnevale, he works at Georgetown here in the DC area at the Center on Education and the Workforce. And he put this in pretty stark terms, saying colleges in America didn't set out to do this, but in a passive sense, they've become the capstones in a system that guarantees racial inequality. And that cuts across economic lines as well. Now, they've collaborated with a group called Opportunity Insights, and they put out a college mobility report card. I think this is one of the most interesting kind of broad rankings for higher education institutions because they were looking at the schools that were providing the most access to low income students and were helping them develop fruitful careers that led to higher incomes that would likely break that chain of intergenerational poverty, allow students to have successful lives and careers and families. And when you look at the list of institutions, it's pretty impressive that the vast majority are regional public institutions that most would not think of necessarily as elite, but they play a truly critical role in our broader society. So a full half of the top 10 were from the City University System of New York, CUNY. There were a handful from the Cal State system as well. The vast majority of them were affordable regional public institutions that were actually doing an incredible job with this work. But in a lot of the discourse around higher education more broadly, we're kind of lost in the conversation. We also know that programs don't have an equal impact on students from different backgrounds. And this has become an increasing area of focus for a lot of our other partner institutions. There is a persistence of inequity after graduation. There's been so much focus on student success. how we close achievement gaps for students of color, students from low income backgrounds, that we haven't historically grappled as much with the problem that these students still have a harder time finding a good paying job after they graduate. Actually, the vast majority of job opportunities are never posted transparently online. There's still so much of the economy that is driven by your network, who you have access to, who you know in a given industry that can make the connection, offer you an internship that turns into a job long term. There's still this very infuriating trend of entry-level jobs requiring years of experience to get in. So if you haven't been well versed in that industry already, you don't have the connections to get those internships, it can be very difficult to break into that space as well. All of this equates to the reality that Black college graduates have much higher unemployment than their white peers, even though they're coming out of, in many cases, similar institutions with equivalent degrees. There have been a number of different institutional responses to this type of dynamic. Even some elite institutions are thinking, well, our job doesn't really end when the student graduates from the institution. There's more we need to do. One, to deal with some of these issues of inequity, but also because the nature of work and careers is also changing. And so it's not enough for students to get a bachelor's degree. It's not enough for them to come back once and get a master's degree in many cases. There's increasing pressure to become centers of lifelong learning so they can stay ahead in their careers and keep their skills as relevant as possible. A couple of interesting examples in this space. The Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania are working on something called the Never Ending MBA. So rather than force students, often early in their careers, right, in their 20s or 30s, to take 2 or 3 years off, invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in tuition in that program, and then learn a lot about actually executive leadership that won't be relevant for them for maybe 20 or 30 years. They've actually unbundled that experience and then mapped that over a 20 or 30-year period. What are the initial skills that these early career advancers really need right now? What are the networking experiences they really value throughout that process? And then how do we bring them back later in their career to make sure that they have access to the executive networks that are really helpful, the learnings on managing big, intricate, complex organizations later on when they need that type of skill development and not so early on in their careers? Folks like Harvard Extension, the University of California system are building out a 60-year curriculum, understanding that it is simply not enough to graduate students with workforce-ready skills now, because a lot of those skills might be out of date in the near future. There's also a potential kind of dystopian outcome from a lot of this discourse about the dichotomy between the liberal arts and workforce ready skills. And there are folks who have worried that maybe in the future we'll have most institutions focused on job ready skills. Most non-elite public colleges will end up becoming professional training programs. Corporations will move more and more into this space. And then in the future, the only folks who actually get to study the liberal arts are folks who attend one of those top 100 or so elite institutions across the country. I think that's a risk. There are some indicators that higher education is moving in that direction in a step-by-step fashion. So that's something we also need to keep in our minds. Make sure that even for low-income students, that they have the ability to major in these types of fields and disciplines that give them really critical workforce-related skills, but also tools to navigate the world as citizens as well. As I said, there are risks to overly focusing on technical skills or workforce training as well, especially in emerging fields or fields that are turning over quite quickly. There's actually a projected decline, for example, in the number of computer programming jobs across the next 10 years. Part of that is driven by outsourcing. Companies are simply sending more of those jobs to India and other parts of the world where it's cheaper to hire folks who have those competencies. We're also seeing candidly that more and more of those job roles are being automated. So more and more machine learning and artificial intelligence actually allows computers themselves to do some of that coding for some of the lower level competencies. A lot of the highly technical skills that we see in demand right now in the labor force last on average about 5 years. You focus on developing curriculum for a new coding language and computer science. The reality is that within 5 or 6 years, you need to redevelop that from scratch because companies or corporations are using something entirely different. There's also been historically across the past 10 years or so, a huge focus on STEM programs. A lot of government funding moving in that direction, a lot of states nudging their institutions to prioritize those types of programs. But what we see is that almost half of graduates from STEM programs at the undergraduate level are not working in a STEM field 10 years after they graduate. So they go into those programs, they find that maybe they're not satisfied with the career path, maybe they don't have the skills they need to actually succeed in that space anyway, but it's a very difficult job path for them. And so an overt focus on technical or professional skills also carries its own risks in this space as well. Finally, there's the profusion of alternative providers here as well. So what we've captured here on the left is data from IPEDS, the National Center for Education Statistics, that shows how many credit-bearing certificates are conferred by four-year colleges and universities in the US. So across that roughly 4-year period, there were just over 300,000 certificates conferred. But you compare that to what's coming from some of the largest corporations in the country, and it is very stark, the difference in volume here. IBM by itself accounts for conferrals of about 1 million badges over the course of 4 or 5 years. These are structured a lot like traditional curricula. So they have a number of different courses within that particular area of focus. They are not specifically focused necessarily on proprietary IBM software or technologies. And so there's actually broad industry recognition for an IBM badge. This is something that someone can put on their resume and actually get the attention of a corporate recruiter in that space, for example. We're seeing growing efforts from Google to move into this space as well, actually partner with universities to offer certificates focused in the IT space. More and more, we're seeing boot camps. We're seeing the likes of Coursera and edX also develop some of their own short-term programs that are either competing directly with universities or using, in some cases, university content to compete with more traditional enrollments in face-to-face programs. Now, what do we do with all of this information? It seems like there's a lot of pressure on universities to do multiple things at once. We need to preserve the liberal arts, the core of the undergraduate experience. We also need to make sure that students are more workforce ready. We need to provide better access to technical or professional skills, but also be wary that those might not be relevant for students after just a handful of years after graduation. One framework that we bring to other universities, which has been very helpful in articulating this process and thinking about how you create complementary opportunities for students, again, this is not an either-or proposition, is the idea of a T-shaped professional. This is the idea that every successful professional in the world of work needs a combination of universal competencies and also some more narrow mastery of technical or professional skills. So when you hear a lot of the discourse about skills gaps, often it actually focuses on the top of the T, those more collaborative, universal foundational competencies. Some would call these soft skills. I think that's actually a pretty bad term for something that's so important. But they're skills like problem solving, communication, collaboration, leadership, and things like that. But what we're hearing more and more is that students also need some deep mastery. They need some familiarity with engineering, with computer coding, even with basic business skills like accounting or marketing strategy, for example. This is really helpful in thinking about where the opportunities to augment existing programs might be. If you're coming from a liberal arts focused program, something in the humanities, for example, how do we help students articulate the universal competencies they're getting from instruction in that space? And then how do we make sure we're giving them opportunities to build some basic mastery and technical skills, especially when they're first navigating into the workforce, which is where those liberal arts grads often experience the most friction. Alternately, in professional programs in STEM fields, for example, where we're focusing a lot more on mastery of a more narrow process or technical field, how do we make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to master those basic competencies as well? Something we hear often from employers that we've interviewed for our research is maybe they hire whiz computer coders at the entry level. That's their focus. And they often find that within 2 or 3 years, those folks who are some of the best computer coders they've ever found actually hit a career plateau because they don't have the leadership or collaborative skills needed to actually lead teams of coders themselves. And so they're thinking about partnering with universities to help develop some of those universal competencies moving forward, because that's a huge roadblock in development of some of their emerging talent internally as well. So again, it's a complementary process. So here's how we think about the most constructive path forward. College should be an intellectual experience. It should also provide some basic training for students to be able to access well-paid jobs after they graduate from your institution. So where I want to go from here is talking a little bit about what we can do around undergraduate programs and the existing core of the institution, especially relatively minor modifications that help students map out a pathway to the types of experiences that are valuable as they conduct their first job search coming out of college. So how do we help them articulate the actual competencies or skills that you're already giving them for a successful career? And then I want to talk a little bit about new academic programming, how we think about aligning with workforce needs, emerging skill needs as well. Now with that, I want to put a question to you and would love to pause to take any other questions as well. I'm curious for thoughts from folks in the room. How should the changing nature of careers shift the way we educate students? Should it primarily be through changes to the undergraduate program? Should we think about complementary offerings? What new ideas does this information potentially elicit for you? So I also see a question from Matt. Do you have more information on universities utilizing LinkedIn for staff development and opportunities within the classroom? Yeah, it's a good question. So you guys have a pilot effective in August. That's exciting. So I haven't heard a lot of concrete examples about LinkedIn Learning. I know some career services offices that we've heard from are thinking about utilizing that as a potential tool moving forward. A slightly different version of that is institutions that are partnering with Coursera, for example, have partnerships in place that allow their existing undergraduate students to access some of those paid MOOCs for free. So for example, at Duke, where they have one of those partnerships in place, they actually promote a lot of the skills-focused courses. For example, let's make sure students are taking a data analytics course. Because in the past they found that those were available on campus, but students couldn't fit it into the curriculum, or they were worried about their quantitative skills and wanted to take it in a more risk-free environment. And so they could take the MOOC. It was largely self-paced. There was no risk involved because it wasn't going to impact their GPA. There was no risk that they would fail and then have to retake those credits moving forward. So there are certainly other institutions that are building out those pathways, whether it's through LinkedIn Learning or another platform. And I think that's a great opportunity to think about some of these complementary areas of skill development as well.
So Max, one of the things, building on the LinkedIn conversation, one of the things we're exploring this year is through LinkedIn Learning, would those kinds of courses or incorporating some pieces of those courses into academic programs, does that help on the technical professional skill development piece of your question? And so I think that's what Matt was referring to. We've for example, in our Masters of Health Administration, the faculty have incorporated some of the LinkedIn Learning skill pieces into that so that then they can focus on the higher functioning kinds of questions, knowing that everybody's competent at the skill they need to be able to then participate in those conversations.
I think that's a really smart way to leverage that type of resource. And so something we'll talk about in just a second is how do you actually help students in these programs articulate the competencies that they've learned? So not only teach them the skills, but also teach them how to talk about that with prospective employers and embed that in the curriculum, which is not something necessarily that a lot of programs do here. So that provides the benefit if you're engaging with LinkedIn Learning, both of learning the technical skills in the short term, but it's also to a certain extent teaching students how to engage with a lifelong learning platform, right? So they're learning how to learn from something like LinkedIn Learning, which then gives them more comfort and familiarity to do that themselves later on. And so that's kind of both sides of the coin, which can be really helpful. So I love that practice.
The other thing that we've done traditionally is have industry or professional advisory councils that engage with departments to give kind of real world experience. And I don't know, some of you others that are on this call know a lot more about that than I do. You might weigh in on that, on what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Max, I'm Dave Miner. I'm the Dean of the College of Business. And I think Cliff just touched on a key point. We don't know where the careers are going to go. It's increasingly important that we keep the pulse of what employers are looking like. And I liked your T. It's a balance. If they don't have the key technical skills, the competencies, they don't get the entry-level position. So giving them that horizontal, what will make them successful in 10, 20 years becomes a little bit of a moot point and frustration. To me, it's these not just college level advisory boards, but drilling it down to departments and majors. In some cases, I've got departments they probably need 2 or 3. So they're really keeping that pulse. And then also on the student side, reinforcing that need to pick up kind of those complementary skills. I'm IT by background. Some of our most technically gifted students would get entry-level jobs and then not progress. We watched employers pass on students that we thought were good enough, that were those future analysts, project managers, the top of the T. And that's frustrating. And I know there's been pressure. Everybody's trying to do more with less, hit the ground running. So they're looking for that perfect fit, bring them in, minimal training, like you said, less investment. That's a challenge right now. But I think the key is if we don't give them the entry level, it's going to be hard to take advantage of the top of the T.
Yep, for sure. And I think there's a piece of this that comes from the corporate private sector side as well, David, right? So your point that in some cases, employers are actively recruiting, often for someone who just has the technical skills they need right now, and they're not as focused on a future path for development, right? Or using their entry-level workforce as their future leadership, in 10 or 20 years. That was something that candidly had started to change before the onset of this recession. So what you see during an employment market where there is relatively low unemployment, most folks are employed. It actually makes it very difficult to replace folks who leave, who look for more fruitful positions, right? So we started to see an uptick in spending on training and development, spending on tuition reimbursement, other types of leadership and growth activities for lower level employees. Unfortunately, during a recession, often those are the first things to go for a lot of corporations. So that's a tricky balancing act for sure.
Max, this is Frank Einhellig. It seems to me like as we observe what has happened, different sectors of the education spectrum have taken different pathways here. If we take the medical approach of the last 25 years, they've put a lot of things at the graduate level that were formerly at the undergraduate level, and it's been a constant movement upward. If you take the history in the STEM areas, it's been known for a lot of years that if you get a bachelor's degree, you're very likely, if you want to work in the field, going to need to move on into a higher degree if you're going to work in that discipline area. And yet there are pressures in other fields in education now, but it's almost taken the reverse trend. They haven't pushed it upward as a mandate near as much, perhaps because of cost. So different sectors are taking different approaches.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point, Frank, and appreciate you bringing that up. We broadly see a pressure towards up credentialing, right, or the need for further, graduate degrees for folks in fields where maybe historically a bachelor's was sufficient. Part of that is just driven by, unfortunately, our own success within higher education of increasing access to more students. So the greater proportion of the population that holds a bachelor's degree, the lower the advantage you have from having one in your career, right? And so we're seeing that play out, and that's actually embedded in some of the criticism of higher ed, where actually the difference in salary outcomes between, I should say the salary gains for someone gaining a bachelor's degree is lower than it has been historically, simply because a larger proportion of the population has them now, right? So to differentiate, you might see some forces that urge you to go back to graduate school for a master's degree. As an example, in certain highly competitive urban markets, we're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., such a large proportion of the population holds a graduate degree of some sort that if you're applying even for entry-level jobs, you'll have a very difficult time accessing a job with just a bachelor's degree, even from a well-known institution in that particular space, a very good academic record. It's just incredibly competitive, which then drives up the demand for further credentials moving forward as well.
Max, it's Sean. I just wanted to, I think this is a great question, and just a couple of comments that may connect to some of our participants. One of the things that we've been working on under Cliff and Frank's leadership for a number of years is really improving our interdisciplinary partnerships. And so related to this question, it seems like we certainly have opportunities at the undergraduate and at the graduate level for academic colleges to partner to serve and prepare our current students. And I'm also wondering what we could do to connect some of these certificates in any academic college to serve both our current students, but also benefit local or regional industries. Just a few thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. Certificates are a big piece of this process because they are short format. They give the students the opportunity to develop some of those complementary skill areas, and it's different depending on the population in some cases. Actually, one of the fastest growing program areas, for example, in engineering is engineering management, which is really just a way to teach existing engineering professionals some of the foundational skills that they were missing, right? So it's called leadership. Really, it's focused on collaboration and critical thinking and communication because a lot of employers are saying that's what their workforce currently lacks. Certificates are a great way to provide some of those complementary skill development opportunities as well, especially if they're more deeply embedded in the undergraduate experience, or you can be a little bit more directive in helping students navigate towards the program that really fits where they need more development themselves. I see a response as well in the chat from Kelly in response to the question we have up on the screen. Maybe integration of career readiness skills into the gen ed curriculum would help set the stage for the importance of developing and marketing these skills, which is certainly an interesting point as well.
Max, this is Victor Matthews. I'm wondering, I represent one of the humanities colleges. How do we make inroads into industry if we don't have connections with them ordinarily? How do we broaden that conversation and make sure that they know what we have to offer and get them in to talk to us?
That is a great question. Why don't we put a pin in that? Not that I want to dodge that question, Victor, but I think it might become a little bit more clear after we talk through the next couple of slides here. So where I want to pivot for a minute is thinking about career development for undergraduate students. And I want to think about this as really just putting some wrapping around the incredible work that's already being done at the undergraduate level. Really one of the key gaps for students graduating, especially from liberal arts or humanities programs, is they have a lot of the skills that employers are looking for, but they don't necessarily know how to talk about them. They're actually quite bad at marketing themselves and their own experience to prospective employers. And employers in many cases are equally bad at actually finding students who have the experience or the types of skills they're looking for. So there's become, and there's a lot of research behind this as recruitment becomes itself more automated, where, you know, we're sending in thousands of resumes for every job opportunity. And so as a result, we're focused a lot more on specific technical programs as preparation for this particular job, rather than someone who is incredibly smart, a quick learner, good communicator, and has a bachelor's degree in history, for example, and they're kind of weeded out of that process before they even get a pair of human eyes on their resume. This articulates some of the problems, even from some of your best undergraduate students. They do everything you ask them to do within the course of their undergraduate studies. They take the courses required. They engage in some form of experiential learning. They complete all the gen ed requirements you put in front of them. They graduate with honors, and then they start applying for jobs. And they really don't know how to talk about what they learned and how it's applicable. They don't know what the employers are looking for. So they talk about what courses they took. They talk about their level of achievement in some of them. They talk about how going abroad was fun, but it doesn't necessarily articulate anything that would be valuable to the employer. Now, in order to help students do this at scale, there are a couple of ideas that we've come across in our research that have been hugely valuable for these institutions in building out essentially a map for students to understand parts of the hidden curriculum. So the things that go beyond the explicit requirements you put in place, but are actually really valuable for them to develop some of these career-ready skills and then be able to talk about those with prospective employers after they graduate. This particular one comes from Queen's University, which is up in Canada. And for each of their undergraduate majors, they developed what they called a major map. So this goes beyond the specific curricular requirements for the program and is much more focused on complementary or co-curricular experiences that they might have within the institution. And they're making it explicitly relevant to that major or disciplinary area. And they're talking about the skills you develop along the way and how that could connect to potential job outcomes at the end of the process. So a few things I'd call out here. One, this is mapping out the process on a year-by-year basis. So in particular, we hear a lot in our research that career services and folks who work in that division really have a hard time engaging students across the first 2 years at the institution. Often, if they're proactive, they might start showing up in their junior year. More often, they're seeing 90% of students in their senior year who are saying, I'm looking at the calendar and I realize I have to leave after I graduate. What do I do? Help me figure this out. They're building out a process to make sure that students are starting that career exploration a whole lot earlier. They are proactively recommending things like an internship or a co-op experience, often in their second or third year. Often they have specific disciplinary or departmental guidance on what types of internships have been most valuable for their previous students. They have, as you can see on the right-hand side, ideas for where their skills are actually applicable in career settings. Again, this is just a list really of occupational groups or job titles. There's a lot more detail that you could provide here, either in an advising conversation with those students, you know, through career services, whatever the case might be. It also has a big focus on student activities and co-curricular experiences and service learning as well. So something that we found is that institutions are investing a lot in building out co-curricular, almost resumes or transcripts that help students articulate what they've learned from actually leading a student group on campus where they have to convene people, they have to manage conversations, they are owning projects from start to finish, sometimes in really complex ways. Sometimes that teaches them a lot of different skills that are complementary to what they're already learning in the undergraduate core, right? But these are the types of universal competencies that a lot of employers are looking for. This type of initiative came out of a cross-departmental collaboration on campus. So folks in career services, the faculties there, so faculties in Canada are the equivalent of schools or colleges here in the US. And it's something that they revisit essentially on an annual basis. And so through that process, they're actually mapping out the skills that students have and actually gives them the explicit language that they can start to put in their own resume, for example, or something that they can actually start to tease out in a little bit more detail in some of those cover letters and submissions for early jobs. They rolled this out and saw huge success and really positive feedback from their undergraduate students. You can see some of those results at the bottom here. 95% of the surveyed students said it helped them understand the skills and careers associated with their program, right? So even for students who haven't committed to a major, helps them understand how X leads to Y in terms of potential career paths moving forward. It also helped them be aware of opportunities on campus beyond the academic core. So how do I think about the right club to join? I know I don't have time to do everything that I'm interested in, but I want to find something that's fun where I can meet some friends, but also will have some potential relevance on my resume or for my career moving forward as well. And that was hugely fruitful for a lot of students involved here. That's candidly a big institutional initiative. So when you think about building out these types of major maps for 30, 40, 50 majors across the institution, it takes a lot of time. That being said, we've convened a lot of our own partners to create a working group and essentially a process map for how to build this out. So if this is something that's interesting, there's a lot more guidance and support we can provide on this major mapping process because it's been really beneficial for the institutions that have put that into place. The other example that I'd want to provide I think is a lighter lift version, something that you can kind of more organically push from the bottom up. So for individual faculty members who are designing their own syllabi, this is essentially just translating terms. So how do we take what we are asking students to accomplish in the context of a given course and explicitly call out in a given section of that syllabus, what are the workforce ready competencies or skills we are helping them to develop? So yes, you are going to be evaluated on this group presentation at the end of this course. It accounts for X percentage of your final grade for the academic term. But don't just tell me what I need to do in order to get a grade. Also tell me why this is important for me to learn. What am I getting out of this experience? I have experience working collaboratively in a dynamic group. I've been able to leverage my oral presentation skills. We're actually able to analyze a set of data, use our critical thinking, and then present a set of findings to our peers. Maybe we incorporated some feedback and iterated on that process to improve it moving forward, whatever the case might be. This is not about redesigning courses. This is really not about changing anything that's currently being done in those courses. It's just giving to students, again, the language that they can use to bring directly to employers. Because the biggest point of friction for liberal arts and humanities grads is that first transition into the workforce. All of the data that we see is that those students typically, on average, have more fruitful careers. They tend to earn more than folks who major in most professional fields. Obviously, there's a lot of variation there, but they tend to earn more. But they also have the hardest time getting that first job out of college. They don't know how to talk about their skills. They don't feel like they have the experience to compete with folks who have some years of experience under their belt. They feel like they're lacking the technical skills that really seem to be in demand from other types of fields. So this can be hugely, hugely beneficial and is something that is relatively light lift to start putting into place on a relatively short timeline. So those are a couple of ideas around the undergraduate core. Certainly, there are other things institutions have done. So to the question earlier in the Q&A box, yes, institutions have redesigned their gen ed core to think more about how they map to these universal competencies, right? So how do we think about courses maybe that are focused on collaborative skills? It's not as much about discipline, but more about giving them the option to pursue development of these skills, maybe across a broad variety of disciplines. So still giving students the ability to explore, but focusing the opportunities more on what will feel relevant to them in the workforce. I think there's a balancing act to be had there as well. So I'm curious, and I'll open it up again. And Victor, if I partially address your question or if that elicits some new ideas, would love to hear from you as well. But how comfortable do you think your undergraduates are at navigating that hidden curriculum? And how would you think about articulating some of those skills for your own courses within your own department moving forward, if that's the case?
Well, it doesn't hurt us to be more explicit, whether it's in the syllabus or just talking during class. I liked all that said, and of course they're all familiar. But the question I was asking really was, how do I get those people out there in industry to want to talk to us so we can tell them about the skills we're developing?
That's a challenge for sure. So part of this is universities typically have done a pretty poor job of engaging with employers. So a lot of the activity is focused around a specific action or disciplinary area, right? So there's an engineering firm, they have a very good relationship with the engineering department at the school. And that's the extent of the relationship that they've built up over time. They actually haven't thought about how the university can help them develop new leaders or source new entry-level talent on the business side of the organization, where they're actually not actively hiring engineers in some cases. So something we'll touch on in the last section is, how do you build an infrastructure for engaging with employers? It is really not about specific colleges on campus doing that work, but creating a more holistic picture for employer engagement. And then when you do that, you can start to talk a lot more about the different pieces of a university that have historically not always had success engaging with them, right? So they're interested in, they might be interested in training for their employees. They might be interested in getting their hands on graduates in the hottest technical fields, but there's a process of almost re-educating how they think about the university as a prospective partner there. Because to your point, Victor, I haven't seen really many case studies of, a college of liberal arts or humanities that has been successful on its own in engaging with employers, because the employers just don't know what to get out of that necessarily.
So I'm Tammy Yankee, and in charge of a lot of the STEM disciplines, and our undergraduates are not comfortable navigating that hidden curriculum. So about 5 years ago, we started doing what I call a reverse career fair, and I got it out of the Chronicle that somebody else was doing this. And basically, you have a career fair, but first every company does a 3-minute elevator speech about what their company does, what they're looking for, and then the students in the companies sit at round tables, and someone feeds them questions. So they have to talk to each other, because STEM students don't know how to talk to employers anyway, right? So they sit around the tables, and at least they start asking and talking about the right kinds of questions. And then we let them go talk to each company individually, and maybe hand over their resume. And that's valuable right now, as we're doing a virtual one coming up in a couple weeks. I'm not sure how that's all going to work, but those skills are so important. I know even our geology faculty do a speed dating event with geologists and all of their majors, just to have those conversations, and they're really, really important.
Absolutely. I love that example. I think that's a great practice. The other thing I bring up here, and something I've heard from other groups where we've presented these practices, is this is not a way for you to dictate where students spend their time outside of class, or overly narrow their options. Again, it's just giving them a way to think about how these are also career and personal development tools, and not just fun ways to spend their free time, right? There can be elements of both. So for students who are struggling with their oral communication, for example, getting them on the college radio station where they are just forced to talk for hours every week and actually learn how to communicate through practice in a pretty low impact environment could be a great example of how you go about that process yourselves. I see some comments in the chat as well. So Elizabeth, there's a workshop, so marketing your study abroad experience each semester. How do you prepare those folks and identify the transferable skills they developed through their international experience and then articulate those to employers? So I love that idea. That's incredible, right? So the flexibility, the adaptability, the understanding of how you communicate with folks from different cultural backgrounds. There's a lot of survey data that students rank studying abroad as one of the highest impact experiences they have in college. And so, again, arming them with the ability to articulate what's different about that is really helpful. I see a question from Dennis. So Dennis from the West Plains campus, 2-year open admission campus of the system. How might the Springfield campus's 4-year and grad programs partner with our 2-year campus toward workforce development? While we seek to prepare our students for transfer for a bachelor's degree, increasingly some of our programs are terminal with the focus on gaining skills and knowledge needed for a specific career. Are there models out there or programs that you know that are unique partnerships between 2-year programs and bachelor graduate programs? That's a really interesting one, Dennis. I myself am less familiar with the 2-year college space, as some of my colleagues focus a little bit more there, but we can certainly take that question away and see what we have there. I'll say that some of the examples we've had from the undergraduate space, an example here is BYU Idaho, is institutions that are focused on serving undergraduate students from a more non-traditional background. So someone who's a working adult is maybe only enrolled part-time. They're actually front-loading a lot of the more technical or workforce-oriented skills in those bachelor's programs. So essentially they have 3 certificates that can stack into the full bachelor's. You can go and get your certificate and leave if that's enough to get you a good job. You can complete 2 certificates. Those actually encompass a full associate's degree. So you can sometimes give students the opportunity to reverse transfer, right? The idea that you complete part of your bachelor's and then actually articulate that for an associate's degree if you need to stop out temporarily for personal reasons. So there are a couple of interesting ideas that I've seen floating around, but can certainly follow up on that as well. Looks like Kelly has some more helpful suggestions for folks who are thinking about how to map out those competencies, identify what those are. Appreciate everyone jumping in. So in the interest of time, want to move forward, talk a little bit about aligning the portfolio with market demand. So a lot of what we focused on so far is complementary to existing offerings, especially how we focus on serving undergraduate students. To some of the comments we've had earlier, there is also a growing demand for new programs, for especially graduate programs in a lot of these spaces where actually a bachelor's degree is not enough for folks in that field to be able to access the jobs that maybe historically they had been able to with that type of credential. Now, it's really important to note how competitive some of these new program fields have become incredibly quickly. So one of our partners at Webster University shared that in today's environment, it's no longer if you build it, they will come. Now, if you build it and the program is in demand and you do a really good job marketing it, then maybe they will come. So within even the past 20 years, we saw through essentially the year 2014, a period of unparalleled growth in the graduate space. What we've seen since then is a slowing of that growth. And so as more and more institutions are rushing to launch new graduate programs, we're seeing that potentially students aren't as interested as they were before, or at least there's not a population that continues to grow that is seeking out those credentials, which puts a lot of pressure on how you validate those ideas and make sure that you're likely to enroll students. What we've learned from doing some research in this space is that there are typically 3 failure paths in these types of new program launches. Many of them simply lack market demand validation of any sort. So it is based primarily on some anecdotal data that you have, things you've heard from students who have graduated. Maybe you have an employer advisory board for that particular program. They are sharing some insights from their own companies, but actually potentially they're outliers from what the industry at large is experiencing. All of those can be pretty risky propositions. And so without more comprehensive and nuanced market data about what the state of the industry is, about how occupational needs are changing, that can be really risky. A lot of institutions don't necessarily go far enough in mapping out how enrollment will lead to revenue for the institution as well. So you can actually end up over-investing in certain programs, successfully enrolling students in some cases, and actually not generating the revenue that you were hoping for that might help subsidize other activities at the institution. And these programs candidly take a long time to start to bear fruit as well. So I work in this professional and graduate space most closely, and it's very typical for programs to take 3 or 4 years after they launch simply to break even on the initial investment. So it might take closer to 5 or 6 years for some of that net revenue to actually start flowing in, allow you to hire new faculty to support other programs, invest in faculty development, whatever the case might be at your institution. There are other missteps that we see here as well. And one of the more common ones is how you misinterpret the success of peer programs in your given area or region. So this is a very typical timeline that we've seen for universities that we just start to partner with. They might put out requests for proposals for new programs. They might propose a specific program, for example, a master's in public health for this particular university we partner with. They looked at some of the completions data from other in-state institutions there, and they saw that there was a high number of existing programs and there was a high number of completions from those programs. And ultimately, when you think about it, you could articulate that in a couple of different ways. You could actually experience that and say, well, that's a sign that there's very high demand for this program, and maybe we need to launch something as well to satisfy that within our own region of this broader state. What they missed in this particular case was that the market was already fully saturated, that when they actually launched this program, there was no real differentiator that would cause students to choose their particular program over one from another institution. So really what we're looking for when we're talking about identifying new programs that might align with labor market demands, and we focus a lot on labor market demands because it's often the best indicator of student interest for graduate programs. So when we're thinking about those T-shaped professionals, often these are liberal arts or humanities grads themselves who are going out into the marketplace and then a few years into their career, recognizing they need something a little bit more technical or professional in nature to help them stand out in their career. So they're looking for something that has a very explicit connection to career outcomes. So there's that long-term correlation between labor market demand and student enrollment interest. But more and more, the competitive set or some of the nuances of the institutions that are in your state or your broader region is really important as well. We have identified a handful of fields that are so saturated and so competitive that despite high labor market demand, it's very unlikely that new institutions entering that particular discipline will be able to succeed in that space. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind as we think about new program opportunities, what we might launch, what types of programs will really resonate with students moving forward. A couple of examples here, just to kind of tease out what this process looks like. For that same institution that was proposing that master's in public health program, they were trying to identify a suite of health professions programs. They had a pool of money from the state to develop those. They looked at a field like respiratory health, which had pretty moderate demands compared to some of the other programs that they were looking into. When they dove a little bit deeper into the context behind that demand, they actually saw some indicators that would grow quite quickly, even if they didn't necessarily see that in the immediate data. So they were looking into the licensing and regulations for respiratory therapists in their particular state. And they realized that the state accrediting board for that particular occupational group had just approved a change that would require all new entry-level professionals to have a bachelor's degree, whereas previously they had only needed an associate's degree. Now, when they started to look at the competitive set, they saw, yes, this program area looks pretty saturated, but actually 12 of the 13 programs are offered at the associate's level. And we know that in 2 years, those will actually be largely obsolete for this audience. So if we move now, this is not a huge market, but this is one that potentially our institution can own if we get out there in front of other institutions that are interested here. The other example is how you think about relative demand as well. What is the relative mix of occupations within your particular region? This example comes from Springfield College, so a small liberal arts focused college in the Northeast in Massachusetts. And they partner with the YMCA to offer human services degrees all across the country. And they had a couple of different locations. And they were trying to figure out what they do with some of these. They had a couple that were under-enrolled. They were trying to figure out where they go next. And they looked at Houston and they thought Houston was this big metro area. There are literally thousands of human services jobs that students who graduate from that program might be able to attain. How do they fit into this competitive ecosystem? And what they actually found is that there was a much higher proportion of jobs in human services fields in a place like St. Johnsbury, Vermont, which is a tiny, tiny town in northern Vermont. But it was a place historically that they also had one of these off-campus locations. And because that was a higher proportion of jobs, there were fewer alternatives for students in that region. Even though human services or social work related fields are certainly not well paid, they were relatively well paid given the low cost of living there, as opposed to in Houston, where the cost of living was more expensive, a lot more opportunities in oil and petroleum fields that could pay students a lot more and potentially seemed a lot more attractive. So even though there were a lot fewer jobs on absolute terms in this rural area of Vermont, they ended up focusing their program development efforts there, and they saw a lot more success from their initiative. So thinking about the industry mix, thinking about actually what the trade-offs for a prospective student might be are a really critical piece of this process as well. Now, I ran through this really quickly. We could spend an entire 90-minute session focused on identifying new program opportunities, thinking through the nuances of program design. That's certainly a big area of focus for me with some of our other partners. What I'll preview here is a full study we did on principled growth. So how you actually navigate that process of identifying new program opportunities, making sure you're setting reasonable goals for enrollment, how you build out the back-end financial picture for some of these programs, because some of these have been very successful in generating enrollment and revenue for their institutions. But we want to help you all avoid some of those more common mistakes that historically we've seen from some of our other partners. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about workforce-related skills, especially foundational skills. Is anyone using market data to inform existing programs? This might even be feedback from employer partners or folks who are participating on your advisory boards. How have folks used this, and have they found it useful in revising existing programs or thinking about what might be relevant as a new offering in the future?
Max, we have our steering committee participating today for the long range plan. And we also have Provost Einhelig's committee that's been focusing on the future of academic programs. And so I just wanted to throw out kind of a connection question. If any of our panelists have responses to this particular question, and then also any suggestions to inform this exploratory conversation and how this feeds to the long range plan of Missouri State.
Well, I just like to give an example of using market data and advisory boards. I lead an MBA advisory board for our MBA program in the College of Business. And at our first meeting, I asked them, this was just a couple of years ago, when you hire an MBA from anywhere, what kind of skills are you looking for? Which ones are the most important? And so we have, lots of members on that board from lots of different industries. Some are alums, most are alums, some are not. But overwhelmingly, they talked about the lack of soft skills. I hate that term too, but lack of soft skills, communication, and that. And so we also did some benchmarking with our peer institutions through AACSB. And we found that several of our peers were offering some kind of soft skill class in their MBA program. And so we approached Sean's college with the prospect of them offering a soft skills class that our MBA students would take as part of the core courses in the MBA program. And that's where we are right now, trying to work out the funding for that. But it's data driven, and I think it has the beginnings of a great partnership with the College of Arts and Letters. I mean, I'm just thrilled that we're working with the Department of Communications. I think they have the expertise to offer those skills to our MBA students.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Elizabeth. I think that's a perfect illustration of how this feedback can strengthen programs, identify opportunities for internal partnerships or collaboration there as well. So appreciate that example. I love that. Well, let's soldier forward. I want to provide just a little bit of background on employer partnerships as well. So we've talked about, to reiterate, a bit about the future of work, a bit about building out competency mapping and complementary opportunities for undergrads, a little bit about new market-aligned programs. I also want to touch a little bit on the employer perspective. So how do employers think about partnering with universities? What do they see as the value? How do those partnerships actually come into place? What are the areas of friction or difficulties or challenges that universities typically experience in this space as well? I want to start by touching on a couple of trends that are newer developments in this space, but are very much worth keeping our eyes on. One is major corporations that are investing in tuition-free bachelor's degrees for some of their employees. So probably Starbucks and Arizona State's partnership is the one that has generated the most media attention. They have hundreds of thousands of employees across the country. They talked about this as something that was really transformational for a lot of their employees who potentially didn't have access themselves or couldn't think about how they could afford and fit the commitment into their work as a barista, for example. The actual results from that partnership have been a little bit more mixed. So yes, they have hundreds of thousands of employees. It's limited to only folks who work close to full-time. It's currently structured only as a completion program. So it requires folks to already have some college credits towards their degree. So they've seen at this point that a couple of thousand of their employees have graduated. Certainly nothing to sneeze at. For a university partner, that can be transformational levels of enrollment as well, but certainly not the hundreds of thousands that they were touting in some of those early press releases. I'll touch on the University of Memphis and FedEx in just a second, because I think that's a very interesting approach. And we work very closely with Memphis and have been out to visit them a couple of times to learn more about their partnership there. The second trend you'll see here in the middle is intermediaries that are moving into this space. So some of you may have heard of Guild Education. They're growing incredibly quickly. They serve as kind of the connective tissue between some of the largest corporations in the country, I should say, and universities that have robust, diverse online programs. So they work with corporations like Walmart or Discover Financial And they, through their partnership with guilds, can offer employees access to online programs across a wide breadth of institutions. So rather than limit themselves to one institutional partner, they're saying we can bring, in some cases, 30 or 40 different universities with a wide variety of programs. We can help with direct billing of those tuition payments. We can build customized portals for your employees so that they can access only the programs that maybe you feel relevant, are relevant for the outcomes within your given corporation. They are already capturing a huge share of this partnership market. So the number of employees represented by Guild's corporate partners is already millions and millions. So we're talking about, I believe, 2 or 3 million employees represented by Guild partner companies. They're also working with a growing proportion of universities. So places like Bellevue and Brandman, maybe not as well known, but are very well recognized in the adult and online space for creating flexible programs. Increasingly, they're partnering with big public flagship institutions as well. So University of Florida Online, they recently partnered with University of Arizona as well. Now, for University of Memphis, this is an interesting example because through this partnership process, they've actually identified a new underserved population of students who likely never would have enrolled under other circumstances. Now, for context, in Memphis, the University of Memphis is right in the heart of the city. FedEx is by far the largest employer in that metro area. So they have their big hub at the airport in Memphis. They actually account for the vast majority of flights in and out of that area. And FedEx had always had a problem with employee turnover. They have a lot of folks who work on the front line in logistics, loading boxes onto planes, getting them onto trucks. They work on rotating shifts 24 hours a day. And they would find that they have to pay big bonuses during the holiday season when things get busy. Folks will come in, they'll work for a few months, and then they'll disappear for a while. Most of their workforce has a high school equivalency or a diploma. And they were really counting the cost of all that consistent turnover in their workforce. And they thought, maybe if we offer education as a benefit to some of these employees, most of whom don't have a college degree, we can actually cut down on some of these ongoing costs that are being incurred by not being able to retain our frontline employees. Maybe we can build a better pathway from the entry level into leadership positions locally. They're also deeply embedded in the community. So they thought maybe this is just a good thing for the population in general as well, help provide access to some of these high quality programs. So they looked at a number of different university partners, some of the online giants that you'd be familiar with. They were having very serious conversations with, but they ended up coming to University of Memphis in part because they were in their backyard, in part because actually a lot of folks at FedEx served on different boards of trustees or advisory boards at the institution as well. And they built out essentially a customized bachelor's completion program for FedEx. Students, or I should say employees at FedEx on day one can enroll in a course at the University of Memphis. So they're not forced to wait 3 or 6 months. There's no limit on how much they can actually pay in tuition. It is fully covered by FedEx, their employer. What they found is that they had some very early success in enrolling students. So last time we checked in with them, which was a few months ago, they already had 3,000 new undergraduate students enrolled. They also discovered that actually a lot of students who had interest weren't actually prepared to jump immediately into an undergraduate program. So they had to build out a developmental pathway as well, something they called Prep Academy. And the university was so invested in this partnership that they said, send us anyone who's interested. If they're not ready for a credit-bearing course at the undergraduate level, we will put them through the Prep Academy on our own dime. So we will only collect tuition from FedEx once we get them through that developmental pipeline and into their first credit-bearing undergrad course. So they've seen already hundreds and hundreds more students who are coming into that developmental pathway because they themselves dropped out of high school or they never had the chance to actually finish that high school diploma. Within the first 9 months, FedEx saw that their staff turnover was cut in half. And so they're already seeing some of the financial benefits from this. We were actually there earlier this year, just before the outbreak of the pandemic, and they were just celebrating the first couple of graduates from this program. So folks who came in with quite a bit of credit themselves, but were able to get through the program. They had a little celebration ceremony, which was incredible. FedEx is actually now using this as a recruitment tool in high schools, saying, come work for FedEx, we will pay you, and then we will help you graduate from college with a debt-free undergraduate degree. It might take a bit longer than 4 years to do if you're working on that part-time, but that's a very compelling argument and has helped them attract new entry-level talent that they wouldn't have been able to access, and has helped the University of Memphis really augment those enrollments and get students into the pipeline who probably never would have ended up on their doorstep otherwise. Now, a couple of notes on partnerships in general. And the one thing I'll focus on here is that employers in general don't know what they want. They really don't know how to articulate the skills that they're looking for. To Elizabeth's example, they might articulate that MBA graduates don't necessarily have the soft skills that they're looking for. Even that is more specific often than what we heard from employers we interviewed for this research. So one of our partners at Western Kentucky held a focus group with folks on her industry advisory board. They were HR staff and plant managers, and they basically said, we just need people who don't do drugs and can work in teams. And if you can build us a program that sources people for us that can do that, that would be worth all the money in the world. But that shows you the level of specificity and nuance that you're often getting from that employer-based feedback. Now, what we found from universities who really stood out in this space is that they avoid some of the three failure paths that we see here. Most universities are entirely too reactive to employers. So rather than figuring out which employers you want to work with and seeking them out proactively in a focused way, there are often folks waiting by the phone, hoping that an employer will call them to talk about a partnership, talk about developing a new program. In which case you're scrambling already to turn things around as quickly as possible, put together a proposal, not necessarily thinking through whether that's the best fit for your institutional efforts or resources. Most universities aim too high. They look for the biggest employer in their region or their state. Those employers are really complex. Often their workforce is heavily distributed or decentralized, which makes working with them really challenging. And so they often overlook the medium or even smaller sized employers in their backyard who have deeper relationships with the institution, are much more likely to engage with you and think about a broader partnership. Finally, there's often a narrow view of partnerships as well. So I reference this around Victor's question. Often employers will see partnerships as more of a transaction. I have this need for communication training for my workforce. So I'm going to seek out someone in the College of Communication. Maybe they'll have someone else they'll introduce me to from an administrative standpoint, but that's really all I'm interested in. When we think about selling something to an employer partner, it quickly becomes focused on content rather than the full breadth of the university experience. That's when you start to run into competitive pressures. Why should I partner with a university when I can just get this from LinkedIn Learning or from Coursera? That becomes a very difficult value proposition to uphold from a university's perspective, where you already have a lot of burdens on your time. You don't need proposals for employer training coming across your desk saying we need to react to this and build out something within the next week or 2 weeks. Now, I'm very cognizant of time and we're very near time. What I'll leave you with is an example of how universities have started to coordinate this approach, understanding that there are pockets of innovation and employer relationships on campus. So this comes from RIT out in New York, and they have brought together a partnership coordination council that includes the heads of all the different external divisions on campus, like alumni relations, their online arm, advancement and development, so on and so forth. The idea here is that they're consolidating top-line unit level data on employer relationships so they can bring all of that together and start to build a holistic picture for who they're working with and how they're doing that, which means from there they can actually prioritize how to grow those partnerships long-term. That means that when someone in the School of Arts and Sciences is interested in talking to employers about how they can get their graduates in front of those recruiters for entry-level positions, you actually have a Rolodex of contacts, folks who already work with the institution, are more engaged there, more likely to take a meeting or a pitch on something along those lines. Whereas if everyone is largely fending for themselves in this employer atmosphere, it's a lot more difficult to make that case. There's a lot more again in this space. So in addition to those resources on new program launch and identifying market demand, we have a full study and toolkit on employer partnerships as well. That could be a conversation itself for another 90 minutes. But I'm cognizant of time, so why don't I stop talking? Allow folks to ask any final questions. Sean or Cliff, I don't know if you want to share any final thoughts with the group before we allow folks to move on with their days as well.
Sean, go ahead, and then I'll wrap us up here.
I just wanted to thank everyone for participating. I was going to see if any members of our steering committee or our chair, Suzanne Shaw, any of the other participants on the provost committee, if there were any final questions or comments. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Cliff, go ahead.
Yeah, again, thanks for joining us today. I do think this last piece with employer partnerships is something that I've kind of had on a list for a long time, and I do think the challenge is every unit doesn't have time to work on this on their own, right? I mean, Tammy doesn't have time to work on this on her own because she got a whole gazillion other things she's working on, and so I think one of the challenge, I'm going to think about this some more myself and with Frank, but I think, for the steering committee working on our next long range plan is, I would ask you all to begin thinking about how would we best coordinate this, right? What ideas do you have? What structure do you think would be helpful in doing this? We started down this road, and then one of the myriad of budget cuts kind of brought everything to a screeching halt. But it's clearly a trend, and it could really be an important access initiative for non-traditional students that are maybe working at Bass Pro or O'Reilly or wholesale groceries or that whole University of Memphis program seems to be kind of an interesting deal, but we can't say, hey, Libby Roselle's in charge of this for the College of Business. She's got other stuff to do, right? And so I think an interesting thought for us is what ideas would the steering committee had in terms of moving in this direction? And Max, we may want to create down the road another kind of focus just on that with kind of a smaller group. So thanks for the good information. Lots of things for our current team that is working on pieces of this, as well as maybe an idea for another subgroup to really work on what would our movement into some local partnerships with local employers, what would that look like for us? Particularly now that we have a much more robust online offering of classes and certificates and degrees. So with that, we'll something to think about. Lots of things to think about today. Max, thanks for leading this discussion, and I'll look forward to talking to Sean and Suzanne more about this potential. So with that, everybody have a good lunch and a good day.